Chapter 3. Processing of Personal Information. Section 11. General Data Privacy Principles. The processing of personal information shall be allowed, subject to compliance with the requirements of this Act and other laws allowing disclosure of information to the public and adherence to the principles of transparency, legitimate purpose, and proportionality. Personal information must be a. Collected for specified and legitimate purposes determined and declared before, or as soon as reasonably practicable after collection, and later processed in a way compatible with such declared, specified, and legitimate purposes only. B. Processed fairly and lawfully. C. Accurate, relevant and, where necessary for purposes for which it is to be used, the processing of personal information, kept up to date. Inaccurate or incomplete data must be rectified, supplemented, destroyed or their further processing restricted. D. Adequate and not excessive in relation to the purposes for which they are collected and processed. E. Retained only for as long as necessary for the fulfillment of the purposes for which the data was obtained or for the establishment, exercise, or defense of legal claims, or for legitimate business purposes, or as provided by law. And F. Kept in a form which permits identification of data subjects for no longer than is necessary for the purposes for which the data were collected and processed, provided that personal information collected for other purposes may lie processed for historical, statistical, or scientific purposes, and in cases laid down in law may be stored for longer periods, provided, further, that adequate safeguards are guaranteed by said laws authorizing their processing. The Personal Information Controller must ensure implementation of personal information processing principles set out herein. Section 12. Criteria for lawful processing of personal information. The processing of personal information shall be permitted only if not otherwise prohibited by law, and when at least one of the following conditions exists. A. The data subject has given his or her consent. B. The processing of personal information is necessary and is related to the fulfillment of a contract with the data subject or in order to take steps at the request of the data subject prior to entering into a contract. C. The processing is necessary for compliance with a legal obligation to which the Personal Information Controller is subject. D. The processing is necessary to protect vitally important interests of the data subject, including life and health. E. The processing is necessary in order to respond to national emergency, to comply with the requirements of public order and safety, or to fulfill functions of public authority which necessarily includes the processing of personal data for the fulfillment of its mandate. Or, F. The processing is necessary for the purposes of the legitimate interests pursued by the Personal Information Controller or by a third party or parties to whom the data is disclosed, except where such interests are overridden by fundamental rights and freedoms of the data subject which require protection under the Philippine Constitution. Section 13. Sensitive Personal Information and Privileged Information. The processing of sensitive personal information and privileged information shall be prohibited, except in the following cases. A. The data subject has given his or her consent, specific to the purpose prior to the processing, or in the case of privileged information, all parties to the exchange have given their consent prior to processing. B. The processing of the same is provided for by existing laws and regulations, provided that such regulatory enactments guarantee the protection of the sensitive personal information and the privileged information, provided, further, that the consent of the data subjects are not required by law or regulation permitting the processing of the sensitive personal information or the privileged information. C. The processing is necessary to protect the life and health of the data subject or another person, and the data subject is not legally or physically able to express his or her consent prior to the processing. D. The processing is necessary to achieve the lawful and non-commercial objectives of public organizations and their associations, provided that such processing is only confined and related to the bona fide members of these organizations or their associations, provided, further, that the sensitive personal information are not transferred to third parties, provided, finally, that consent of the data subject was obtained prior to processing. E. The processing is necessary for purposes of medical treatment, is carried out by a medical practitioner or a medical treatment institution, and an adequate level of protection of personal information is ensured. Or, F. The processing concerns such personal information as is necessary for the protection of lawful rights and interests of natural or legal persons in court proceedings, or the establishment, exercise, or defense of legal claims, or when provided to government or public authority. Section 14. Subcontract of personal information. A personal information controller may subcontract the processing of personal information, provided that the personal information controller shall be responsible for ensuring that proper safeguards are in place to ensure the confidentiality of the personal information processed, prevent its use for unauthorized purposes, and generally, comply with the requirements of this Act and other laws for processing of personal information. The personal information processor shall comply with all the requirements of this Act and other applicable laws. Section 15. Extension of privileged communication. Personal information controllers may invoke the principle of privileged communication over privileged information that they lawfully control or process. Subject to existing laws and regulations, any evidence gathered on privileged information is inadmissible. End of Chapter 3. Please like and subscribe for more audiobooks like this.